last several years, the world, I think, has really begun to realize that if you want to take on the big challenges that we face as a civilization, cities are the place to do that. Cities are the place where you can get leverage on these big problems and really bring them down to size. Problems like multi-generational poverty, crumbling infrastructure that no one really knows how to pay for, and increasingly climate change effects. These are all big challenges that cities are now seen as part of the potential range of solutions that we have to bring to bear on it, and local government has to figure out a way to deal with that. So one of the ideas that's been put forward in recent years, it's kind of a corporate idea to take cities to this next level, is the idea of smart cities. There is no good, best single definition of a smart city. It's really the application of technology, sensors, data analytics, to sort of vertical areas of concern in cities, like smart retail, those kinds of things. The question with a lot of those applications, with those ideas as far as using technology in cities, is what do you optimize for? Is it cost? Is it crime rate? So interestingly, my old boss, so this is Tom Menino, the former mayor of Boston, although he was considered famously to be a Luddite, I think he actually came up with a really interesting way to answer the question of what you optimize for. Mayor Menino got his nickname, the Urban Mechanic, because of his really fanatical approach to creating a people-centered approach to government. And I think that's really the secret sauce here. And so he created a team to implement this idea, which is my team. It's called the Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics. And our job is very big. Our job is to invent the future of the city. The good news is, since we launched New Urban Mechanics back in 2010, this has really become a wave, a global trend of creating these public-oriented labs to drive innovation in cities. And what's different about this approach is that it's driven by a sense of experimentation. Rather than presuming that we know the answer before we do something, let's test it first. Let's see if it works in a kind of a scaled-down version, in a prototype version, and then scale it up once we have success, or shut it down if it doesn't work. And there we are, New Urban Mechanics. So the good news is our new boss, Marty Walsh, our new mayor of Boston, has the same vision, the same idea that cities are great when they can do everything they can to make its people great. So we've been doing this work for a bunch of years now. We've learned a lot of things. We've learned what not to do. And I want to share some of these lessons with a few examples to give you a sense as to how they actually play out in the world. Briefly stated, number one, how you build is just as important as what you build. This is really an acknowledgement of the importance of process, especially as it relates to trying to develop new kinds of solutions, especially technological ones in communities. It's important how you are inclusive when you're rolling these things out. It's important how you consult the public with the kinds of solutions that you're building. So I'll talk a bit about that. Number two, build things that people actually want or need. So this may seem obvious to you, but having worked in government for a few years now, I can tell you that's not what we always do. We often end up building the things that we know how to build. And so the idea here is to let's rethink that. Let's actually focus on what you want and need and build that for you. Number three, using technology to build compassion. This might seem kind of counterintuitive, and obviously when we think of technology, usually we think about it making things faster, better, cheaper, more efficient, those kinds of things. And those are all good things, and we need more of that in the world. But when I think about the real opportunity here with technology in cities, it is to build connections between people, between different neighborhoods, between government, the governed and the governing. So compassion, I think, is a really important key here when we think about technology. And then lastly, it's important to be prepared to challenge people's instincts. So what this is really about is that if we're going to try to make the city better, we can't only appeal to people's rationality in how we think about where we should be tomorrow. We also need to be understanding and appealing to their emotional side. So we'll talk about that. So number one, how you build is just as important as what you build. This is, for those of you that have read books on innovation or go to those kinds of websites, you've seen this kind of thing before, this double-ended funnel thing. This is an innovation pipeline. Many of them out there, IDEO has one, but because this is ours, this is the best one. Essentially, it's three simple stages, right? So it's a simple mental model. Explore, experiment, and evaluate. Although it's simply stated, there's actually some magic here, right? When I think about it, the real value add that my team has brought to local government and to our city is the capacity for experimentation. All innovation requires some kind of experimentation, and which means that there might be some potential for failure. And that's part of our team. Sometimes we're called the Department of Failure. I prefer the Department of Yes. So explore, experiment, evaluate. On the front end, this means that we spend a lot of our time looking for good ideas, challenging problems, interesting collaborators, new kinds of projects. And what we're looking for when we talk to these startups, researchers, community groups, we're looking for three things. The first is we're looking for the potential of impact, right? We don't want to be doing things just for the sake of doing them. We want to be doing these kinds of innovation projects because they have the potential, or we think they will have the potential for making the city better or people's lives better. Number two, we're looking for the capacity for these ideas to be turned into a prototype at all. I mean, there's lots of great ideas out in the world, but many of them are either very expensive or can really only be done at scale. So we're looking for things that we can test and experiment with. And then lastly, we're looking for the potential for for scaling these things up. Do these things have the potential, even a principle, to go from the experimental stage into a scaled-up stage? So if we can find projects that have those three criteria, we move into the experimental phase. And these are literally experiments, right? We've got some kind of a hypothesis, a guess as to what we think will happen, and then we will run it. That often means that if we're trying to do something in schools, for example, we might test it at 3 schools before and see if that works. And if it does work, we'll then scale up to whatever the next logical step, maybe 100 schools, what have you. And then it takes us to this last stage, the evaluate and possibly expand phase. And here, we're looking at what did we just learn through the experimental phase? Does this thing work? Does it not? If it does work, it becomes our job to help those things spread. If it does not work, that's an important thing, right? Failure is really, when I think about one of the inhibitors to innovation in government, and in most institutions, I would say, it is that there's just traditionally never been the capacity to manage failure. Failure is a bad thing when you're in government, but I think by bringing a team that can manage that and sort of provide protection from the negative aspects of failure, we can create a culture of innovation, which is really what this is all about. Number 2, build things that people want or need. So I'm always glad when you can't read the slide because it reinforces the point, right? So this is what you had to read up until 2014. This is the document that you had to read if you wanted to register your child in the Boston public school system, right? This is actually 2 pages of 4, right? So this is a bad experience, right? This is a scary experience. And what we found in talking, as part of that explore phase and talking to parents in the community, the challenge of having to read this often encouraged or disincentivized parents from going through the registration process, because this is the sort of thing you look at and you say, no, thank you, I'll do that next weekend, next weekend, and next weekend. And then for a lot of people, they actually didn't register their kids on time at all. The challenge with that, Boston is a very complicated school system. Basically, it sort of grew up as a system to deal with issues of inequality, which are still very much there in the city. And so you have to get your selected schools in on time. And what we found was that those parents that had three jobs, that were often sort of least educated, were those that were not registering their children for school on time. So this was an equity problem. So there was obviously something we could do about this. We changed the mental model, right? This is essentially this is a platform that we developed a few years ago. This is sort of like the Hotels.com or the Expedia of schools. It allows you to explore different schooling options for your child, and then in hopefully a more elegant way. What's interesting to me about this, the approach that we took here, is that under the covers is this, right? The same system that supports this supports this. So in a lot of ways, this is just a skin-deep redesign. But when we talked to the parents, what they told us was what was painful. They told us that it was the pain of the experience that they were most worried about. And so we realized, what if we just dealt with the experiential part of it and leave the sort of dealing with the heavyweight mechanics till later? And so that's what we did. We just changed the interface, and what we found after we released this in beta back in the day, we saw a big jump in how parents were able to register their kids for school. So this is an important consideration, that when you're going to try to work on changing systems, sometimes it's enough to just focus on the initial experience. Number 3, use technology to build compassion. So back in 2009, Boston was one of the first cities to create an app that allows you to automatically report things into City Hall. Right? So the idea here is called Citizens Connect, and the idea is that you see, as it shows there, some graffiti or a pothole, you took out your phone with the app, snap a photo of it, you click send, it goes to City Hall. City Hall has a system there that sends you a ticket so you can track it, and when we fix it, you get a notification of that as well. But as I said, the idea was about building compassion. And so we really thought about this as an experimental platform, right? So we started in 2009, and we tried a whole bunch of different ideas. Most of those that came from our users, from the public, actually. We used QR codes. Americans don't use QR codes. I don't understand why this is, but not that I love them. But we tried automated systems, and there you can see Citizens Connect was rebranded as Boss 311 a couple of years ago. But what we wanted to try was, does this technology actually improve the way that the public works with the public sector? So what we started doing, by way of a new experiment, was for some of the requests that came in, we would include a photo of the team that did the fixing. So you wouldn't only get a photo of the fixed thing, whatever it happened to be, but you also get a picture of Mike and Steve, right? The theory being that if you, as a resident, if we could give you the sense that your issue is fixed not by the faceless bureaucracy of government or robots, but by people, Mike and Steve or whoever they are, that it would change the way that you thought about the experience, that you would think about it as an interpersonal exchange. And it turns out that it works. It does. So we've been studying this question with some research friends of ours, and we found some interesting results. Whenever we included the photo of the teams, the total number of requests that people responded with went up by 60%. We found that the range of things that they were reporting, potholes, streetlights, graffiti, went up by 35%, and the behavior change lasted for quite a while. So I wouldn't claim that this is necessarily compassion, but I do claim that this is somewhere on the continuum of redesigning or redeveloping the relationship between the public and the public sector. This is another a moment for building compassion. Civic meetings, town halls, what have you, can be anything but civil, unfortunately, sometimes. This is, you often see lots of grandstanding, people standing up and shouting, sometimes at each other. So this stands in the way of democracy, I would say. So we have to do something about this. And it's worth noting that this is 400-year-old technology, if not older, right? We can do better. So one of the things that we began to consider when you look at these public meetings, frequently the people that yell the loudest know the least about what they're talking about. Not always, but often. So we thought, what if, and part of that issue is that people, there's a lack of knowledge frequently that's there in the room, that people don't know what's going on. So we had this idea that what if we could take the learning component out of the room and not expect people to have read all these pamphlets beforehand, but make it fun, make the learning about the civic issue fun. So the idea was to turn it into a game. Right? So we worked with a group in Boston. It's called the Engagement Game Lab, and this is what they do. They build games for civic engagement. And so we turned it into an online experience where people would go through these missions, they would get badges and points, everything you expect from a game. And then the idea was to have those same people come back together in person to deliberate. And what you see, obviously, we changed the physical layout a little bit, right? So we turned it into circles of chairs as opposed to stadium seating, kind of like what we have here. And what you see is a completely different kind of behavior, right? People were talking. There's no one standing up and gesticulating or what have you. It's civil behavior that we're seeing there. And what's interesting also is that not only in general, the civil behavior, but we see different groups of people being involved in the process. This is a 16-year-old talking to a table full of adults, and as you can see, they're listening, right? Because he knows what he's talking about. He's been through the game. He's making solid points. So I think that that's an important consideration when we're redesigning these moments of civil deliberation. The last one, be prepared to challenge people's instincts. In Boston, density is a bad word. It really is. Which means, so Boston is a fairly small city. So it's 49 square miles. It's bounded, for the most part, by other cities and towns and water. So, but at the same time, we're also growing, right? So we have around 630,000 people. In a few years, we'll have 700,000 people. We're not going to be able to grow out. We're not going to be able to annex anybody. And thanks to the Boston Brahmins, back in the Blue Bloods back in the day, you can't build above a certain height either. So we're not going out, we're not going to grow up. So the only way, the future of Boston is about density. It's about how do we use our space more intelligently. The challenge is your average person, your average resident in our neighborhoods equates density to a lower quality of life. They think of tenements, that kind of thing. So that stands in our way of the future of Boston in many ways. So we decided, what if we did something about that? So let's try to find a way to give people different sense as to what density can be. So this is what we did. We built a urban housing unit, and essentially it is a tiny home, right? So if you go online or watch TV, tiny homes, small houses, these are like, it's a trend, and to build things smaller. And so this is 345 square feet, and the idea was that we would take this tiny home as a demonstration, literally, to kind of change people's assumptions, their instincts about what density means. And we drove it around the city. So there we are, in come rain or come shine, right? There's some snow. That wasn't fun. And we bring people into the space. As you can see, it's elegant. I think it looks pretty nice. I wouldn't mind living there. And as we were having people in, we were talking about what this means and the quality of life that they could have. I don't have numbers on this yet, but I would say that qualitatively, the discussion that we're able to have around density in many of our neighborhoods has completely changed, right? Because people are now using this experience as a reference point when they're having that dialogue, which has been critical. The last thing I want to talk about, I did start out the talk referring to smart cities. I will say I'm a skeptic in many ways, even though I'm often called the smart city guy. So what we started doing was compiling what we like least in these big companies that come to us in Boston to try to sell us their stuff. And so we've come up with, I think, some interesting and maybe even snarky pieces of feedback for them. I'll let you read those. I'm not going to read all of them for you. I really wanted to highlight number 2 there, solving real problems for real people. I think, referring back to the problems that I mentioned in the very beginning, I think that we'll only, as a society, as a species, we'll only be able to get at those things until we are actually solving real problems, and not theoretical problems that we can throw theoretical solutions at. I think we really need to kind of roll up our sleeves and really understand how changes in the built environment affects people's lives and focus on those things first. Thanks very much.